Are you a consultant who would like to become more influential? Well, on this episode, we're going to show you how. Welcome to Your Consulting Business Podcast. My name is Russell Pearson, and this is episode number 51. If you are a consultant, if you sell expertise, then you are in the right place, because the Your Consulting Business Podcast comes to you every single week with bite-sized tips and larger strategies on how you can run a better consulting practice. If you would like to subscribe, you just have to click the button there on YouTube and you can subscribe and click the bell to make sure you're notified when we have upcoming episodes. If you are listening to it through your listening ears on your podcasting platform of choice, you can also subscribe there, and we'd really appreciate that. And if you like what we're actually talking about, I would love you to leave a comment or a review. On today's episode, we have a fantastic guest who is going to talk about all things persuasion, all things influence, but also how to get unstuck from being too stubborn. Now, that could be you, the listener, the person watching this video, or it could be your clients. How do we become more influential in that space? Now, this topic can be quite dense. It's actually quite a huge topic or area of expertise. But the guest that we have with us today has an immaculate way of creating clarity from the confusing. And I've invited him to be part of the show to help us actually talk through this topic. He is a friend that we connected years ago through the Professional Speakers Association here in Australia. And he is an award-winning speaker, the author of 10 books. Please make him feel absolutely welcome, Michael McQueen. Michael McQueen, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Russell. Good to spend some time chatting.
Absolutely. We probably don't speak enough yet. We're often in each other's circles in the speaking space. But the reason I wanted to get you on the show today was, well, two reasons. One, you've always got your finger on the pulse of what's changing and moving and coming down the pipe in regards to not just business, but every area of development. But the other thing too is that you're actually bringing out a new book, aren't you?
I am. Yeah, this has been like seriously the hardest thing I've ever worked on. So this is book number 10, but I would say the hardest book I've ever put together, in the sense that I had to dig really deep in terms of the research and cast the net also very wide in terms of a lot of different disciplines to draw on for this book. And so, yeah, it's one of those things, when you work on a project, you get that sense that this could be like a career defining thing. I feel like this
Okay.
book might be one of them. So it's exciting. I can't believe it's finally almost ready for release.
That's awesome, and ideally it'll be released around the time that this will actually be released. The
Yeah, I
show.
imagine so.
Do you have a release date on it?
Yeah, so we're releasing in Australia first. That'll be early November in Australia, and late November, early December, 2023 in the US. So
Awesome.
I'll be over there doing that launch.
Dear listener or watcher, when you're actually listening to this or watching along, I think it's probably got about a week before it launches, so make sure you look out for it. Your past books, can you really just quickly take us through the journey from when you started as an author and the sort of work you were doing to now? Because you've had a few pivots through that time, haven't you?
I have, yeah. So initially, my first body of research was around demographic trends and changes, particularly through a generational lens. So looking at the millennials versus Gen X and the baby boomers and how all those differences played out and how to bridge some of those gaps within a team or an organization. Then the focus of my research shifted to more look at sort of consumer trends and business trends and looking at why businesses tended to not adapt in the face of change, and the whole theme of disruption, and why we saw the Kodaks of the world lose relevance, and trying to pull apart the lessons from that. So I wrote a book a number of years ago called Winning the Battle for Relevance, which was all about that. Then I've
Right.
written a few books about sort of technology trends broadly and what we're seeing happen with AI and robotics. This next one, though, is more the people side of change. So in a nutshell, it's all about the psychology of stubbornness. And really the question that's come up consistently over the years from clients, which is this question of why don't people change even when they know they should, and even when they want to, what causes them to get stuck? And so the title of this book is called Mindstuck, which is, and the subtitle is Mastering the Art of Changing Minds. And so it's all about that whole theory of that theme of persuading people who often know they should change, but just aren't.
That is a big shift for you, I would say, but that's fantastic, and I think that it's something that is definitely needed right now. It's interesting because when I'm speaking with consultants, and ideally consultants are the ones who are listening to this, there's two elements. There's one is how do we help the organizations and the people that we're working with step through change or transformation or whatever word you want to use there. But there's also the realization that in actual fact, we can't help anyone in particular. We can only guide and potentially change ourselves to help influence those around us. I'd love to understand the premise of the book. Like, what position are you coming in on this?
So I think there's a couple of angles I approach the theme from. I think certainly part of the opportunity for all of us is rather than trying to push harder when it comes to persuading or influencing, often what we actually need to do is like figure out how to remove the handbrake. And often we push harder in the sense that we give more evidence, better data, we tell a more compelling and emotive story. But if you don't understand what it is that's causing people to not embrace change,
Yeah.
pressing harder typically backfires. And we've discovered that over the last few years. In fact, some of the most up-to-date research from a neuroscience standpoint, looking at what happens in people's brains when they're fixed in a certain way of viewing the world, the more you push, the more evidence you give, the more solid and the more bedded in their thinking becomes. And I think the challenge is when you come to changing someone's mind, for instance, the first question is, which mind are you actually trying to change? And this is probably the key premise in the book, is this notion that as humans, we actually operate in two different, very distinctly different minds at any given moment. So the language I use in the book is our instinctive mind versus our inquiring mind. And our inquiring mind is the frontal lobe part of our brain. It's logical and linear. It's the most recently developed from an evolutionary standpoint.
Yep.
Our instinctive mind is the bit at the back of the brain, top of the brain stem, mostly connected to the limbic system. So it's driven by emotion. It's typically very tribal, very focused on belonging and belonging cues, but also it's connected to our fight and flight mechanisms. And so if you look at some of the work from, say, Zoe Chance, who's a researcher at Yale, she would suggest that 90 to 95% of our decisions and our judgments are made by our instinctive mind. And the problem is when it comes to changing minds, most of us go straight to the inquiring mind.
Yeah.
We give the evidence and the logic and the facts, not realizing that's not the mind that needs to be changed. And it's a very different game to change the instinctive mind, because one of the most important themes is this: our instinctive minds would rather feel right than be right. And so accessing that and getting people to think again, think twice, update their beliefs, there's a real knack to that. And just giving evidence doesn't work.
No, and there's so many ways that we can actually take this conversation, because obviously there's the topical side of things that you see out there, not just in media, but just in relatives,
Yes,
where
correct.
the conversations are starting to become far more binary.
Yep.
People are taking sides much more strongly. Yet there are other sides to this that we look at. Like, for instance, I've spoken to hypnotists. In fact, I've had quite a bit of training in that space myself. And the realization I had in there was that you can't actually bring someone into a hypnotic state without being in state yourself. And so
Wow.
there's this fascinating connection where you're creating true rapport to enable change to happen. And it sounds like there are some things in there that are similar to what you're talking about. But maybe let's talk about the relatives before we get back into business.
Yeah.
Why now? Why is there such this binary separation of opinion?
Well, I mean, there's lots of things that have shaped this. So certainly the role of technology is hard to look past. I mean, the fact that what we've seen with social media has caused what's often described as the balkanization of belief, this idea of we've separated into our tribes, and the algorithms feed into that, because you tend to see posts or information that reflects with or resonates with what you already decided is true, what you've already clicked like on or followed in the past. So therefore, in that echo chamber, you only see things that become confirmation bias feeding. That
And there's
everyone on
already,
the board.
and that's the thing, right? Yeah, there's already
Yeah,
confirmation biases, the red car syndrome and the
correct.
like. That's already
Yep.
happening, but then the algorithms are reinforcing it because they want
Yes.
you to engage more.
Definitely. So there's that. And then there's also the fact that as humans, we are naturally tribal. So we tend to slot into us versus them, very binary narratives naturally. And we were taught this from the youngest age. You read any kid's story, and it's like the goodies and the baddies, the
Yeah.
heroes and the villains. And our brains like those simplistic narratives. And interestingly, one of the things our instinctive mind does is it creates narrative. So it looks for pattern recognition. So if it sees something, rather than actually asking why, it'll typically make up a story about what's going on, even if there's a whole lot of incomplete information. And typically
Yeah.
those narratives are binary. you're the goodie and I'm the baddie, or I'm the baddie and you're the goodie. Either way, we're against each other. And so one of the things I reflect on in the book is this notion that if we're not careful, we can fall into something called the 2D trap, where we see everything and everyone as two-dimensional. And the D's are like you either demonize or you deify. So people who are on your side, in your tribe, who you agree with, you deify. They can do no wrong. They are the keepers of all knowledge, and therefore we don't engage critically because we just take whatever they say is right because they're on our side and we agree with them. But by the same token, we demonize those who are on the other side, and we assume they've got nothing valuable to contribute. They're reprehensible, or they're evil, or they're immoral, and we keep them at arm's length, or we just lob ideological grenades at them, which also means we can never learn from them. And so the challenge we've got is to try and break down some of these narratives and see the world as complex and three-dimensional, and see ourselves as that as well, not to become so enmeshed in the way we see the world that our identity and our ideology becomes intertwined, because that makes it really hard to approach ideas objectively.
And that's the great, I think, leaping off point to discuss what we can do about it, right?
Just quickly cutting in because I wanted to tell you about a free resource that is available for you right now at russellpearsonprograms.com that's highly relevant to today's topic. If you go over there, you'll find a how to get retainers fast guide that's going to be relevant on how you're going to make money, because retainers are one of the best models for a consultant to run. Go over there after the episode. The link will be in the description. Now back to the show.
So we've set the stage. This is going on. Do we talk from a consultant's point of view of what they can do with self, or do we talk from a point of view of how they can help others?
Well, so I mean, it's probably a little bit of both. So let's start with how you can help others. So if you think just from a professional perspective, because you could talk about how do you sort of navigate all the complexities of dealing with family around this stuff, because in personal relationships, it's just as important, if not more important, and often a bit more tricky in those environments. But if you look just professionally, you're dealing with someone, whether it's a client or a colleague or a team member, or maybe you're trying to influence up, and you're trying to get your superiors on board with an idea or an agenda, and they're stuck. The thing to firstly realize is that what is it that causes that sense of stubbornness? And we tend to assume that humans, by their very nature, are afraid of change. And we say that so often, we just, it's like gospel truth. And yet the most recent research indicates that's not true. It's not that we're afraid of change. What happens in our brains, what causes us to be stuck and stubborn, is we're actually afraid of loss. It's the loss that stops us from being willing to consider, willing to rethink. So the biggest things we fear are loss of certainty. I used to know something, now I don't. I used to know how the situation played out. I used to know how the technology worked. I used to know how this organization functioned. And if we change it, then I won't. That sense of uncertainty is very disorienting. So a sense of loss of certainty, a loss of power, a loss of dignity. The moment, whatever you're suggesting, be it a new proposal or idea or a new way of doing things, the moment it feels like it's going to come at it's going to cause loss, people will dig in their heels.
Wow.
Even if they actually think it might be a good idea, they'll still resist it. And so rather than try to upsell the benefits or the gains of change, lessen the loss. I try and identify what those losses are and either allay those fears, and the key thing you can do is make people feel they're in the driver's seat. The best antidote to a feeling of loss is autonomy, that sense that I'm in control. And so there's lots of tools and techniques in the book I look at around how do you give people that sense of agency and autonomy, because if that's there, you'll find the loss starts to melt away pretty quickly, certainly the fear associated with it.
Let's see if we can touch on a couple of those in a moment. But the reason I was going wow is not just about it being fascinating, even though it is. It's more a case of what that means, because in the transformational space that the majority of consultants are working in, the change of identity, aka the loss of identity, is such a huge process. But that's what happens. To actually get sustaining change, there needs to be an identity shift. And once people realize that they're starting to lose one identity, they'll fight for it.
Correct.
And I've seen that happen time and time and time again.
Yeah, I think there's a loss of identity, but the loss of certainty is a huge one as well. And so I think for a lot of people, if you can just show how what you're suggesting is a gentle improvement on the past, rather than something that does away with everything they've known and feel comfortable with, that's one of the most helpful things you can do. And Robert Greene in his book, the Laws of Power book, talks a lot about how do you do that well. And there's a real art to that. So it makes people feel like this is just, it's a natural
I,
no-brainer.
lo- I love I love the way you phrase things, Michael, because you talk about Robert Greene's book, The Laws of Power, and it's like, there are subtle ways to do it. There are two ways of looking at Robert Greene's work, and
Correct. Yeah. Yep.
it has some interesting connotations if you look on it the dark side. It's
Oh,
fantastic.
actually, and it's a good point, because I think one of the things I was very cognizant of when I was writing this book, and I flag it consistently throughout, is that we've got to use these tools with integrity, because if you
Yeah,
don't, they can be incredibly valuable as sources of manipulation. In fact, what I guess the main way I'm focusing this body of work is around how do we rediscover the lost art of persuasion without resorting to coercion? Because the
yes,
challenge is so much of what we hear in the influence and persuasion space. If you sort of strip it back, it's coercion. It's trying to get people to do things in a sneaky or underhanded way. Ideally, you want to get people to change because they want to and because they see the
yeah.
benefit in it. That they have agency in the process, that it affirms their dignity and their value. That's the stuff that I get excited about, is how to use these tools well.
And it's one of my old mentors used to talk about what was the intention when you come into that. Are you doing it for love or power? And
Yeah,
and
wow.
if you think it's love, double check
Double
the
check.
what is love in this scenario, right?
Yep.
So that's great. So as far as what you can do, obviously these subtle moves, but what are some that people can maybe start to look at, but before they get a chance to actually look at your book?
Well, I think the first thing you need to do is, if you want to win people over to your idea or your perspective, you've got to win them over to you. Like, you got to start with affinity. That sense that people won't be willing to consider what you're sharing until they feel that they can be safe, okay, but also that you're trustworthy. So if you look at the original masters of persuasion, Aristotle and Socrates and Plato, and particularly the whole notion of the foundations of rhetoric. So rhetoric, which was the first real attempt to understand influence and persuasion, there were three things. There was ethos, there was pathos, and there was logos. Those were the three things that persuaded people. We tend to do logos pretty well and pathos. In other words, we appeal to people's minds or their hearts.
Yeah.
But the third part of the equation is the big one, and that's ethos. Ethos is the sense of being credible and trustworthy and attractive in the eyes of those you're looking to win over. And the tricky thing with this is, you do not own your ethos. It is in that perception of those you're trying to influence. It's in
Right.
their eyes.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so if you're going to build ethos and build credibility, you need to win people over to your side. So how do you do that? Self-deprecation. Don't take yourself too seriously. Point out the faults in your own perspective. Point out the things you've gotten wrong in the past, but also make sure people feel like that you're open to their perspectives. This notion that people who are listened to are more likely to listen. Do you go in just with an agenda to get your message across, or do you genuinely go in with a posture of openness? And I think that's so often what we get wrong. We go in with such a plan of how we're going to win over the situation and conquer the other person or our opponent. And the goal we have is they throw up their hands in capitulation and go, "You were right. How could I not have seen this earlier?" And that doesn't
Yeah.
generally happen. So like, in fact, one of the metaphors I found useful in the book is this notion of, don't see arguments as a battle where you've got to win over the other person. See arguments or debates as a dance. It's a few steps forward, a few steps back. You get in sync with the person you're trying to influence. That's how meaningful change occurs.
I love that, and it plays into everything we talk about with sales in particular in this space, which is move into a collaborative situation.
Yeah.
You're trying to create a situation where the person receiving is having as much ownership of the work that's being created as anything else, which
Yeah.
enables them to easily say yes.
Yeah. I mean, it's like that old quote from Dale Carnegie that a person convinced against their will is of the same opinion still. And it's a bit hokey and old, but it's true. Hey, like, if someone feels convinced or coerced into saying they've changed their mind, there's every chance they haven't actually. They're just doing what you're saying. They're doing
Yeah.
what they think you want to hear. They're saying the right stuff, but they're not actually, they've not shifted their view at all. And the moment you look away, or the moment you stop incentivizing that change, they'll go back to doing what they're doing otherwise. No change has actually occurred. And so that's why so many of the tools we've been taught only work as long as you continue to apply the pressure or the
Mm.
incentive or the threat of punishment. And that's exhausting. It's hard to maintain.
Yeah, absolutely. So we come into these engagements in a state of openness. I know you didn't say, but in a state of wanting to collaborate, looking for
Yep.
possibilities. Then what?
I think the next thing is you want to shift their vantage point. You want to get them to a point where they go, "I hadn't seen it that way before." Like, reframe what seems like it's real for them. And I think that's the important thing. One of the most effective tools for doing this is to ask questions. Ask questions that clarify their assumptions, clarify their expectations. Because often when people speak out, what they think is true or real, they go, actually, you know what? Maybe there are some holes in my perspective. There are holes in my argument or my standing point that I hadn't considered before. And so there's a couple of great tools I look at in the book for how do you ask questions that shift people's perspectives. And one of the great ones comes from a researcher named Michael Pantalon. And he calls this motivational interviewing, but it's quite a sort of complex academic type phrase. So I refer to these questions as rate and reflect questions. So if you're dealing with someone and they're stuck in a certain position and they're not willing to consider changing, there's two questions that help. First question you ask is, so out of from a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are you or how willing are you to change, adopt a different perspective, get on board with a new proposal, fill in the blanks, whatever it is.
Yep.
But it's the second question that matters most.
Of course.
And that's where you ask the question, why didn't you choose a lower number?
Oh, that's good.
And that shifts the entire conversation, because now it's not like, okay, what would it take me for you to get you from a 4 to a 6 or from a 6 to an 8? It's like, well, what if you chose 4? Why didn't you choose 3? There's part of you that thinks this is a good idea. Let's start with that, because that becomes a common ground, something we can agree on that has value, and then we can work from there.
In the real estate market, they used to do something a little bit like this, where they would actually say, what is the cost of the home that you're about to buy?
Yep.
What is the cost of your current home? And then you say, all right, well, it's the gap there that we actually need to speak to, which might be $10,000 or $15,000 versus, now $1.2 million difference in the sale, right? Yeah. So absolutely. So we look at the gap and we change the perspective there for sure. What do you think about? So the problem I find people stepping into is they try and put their perspective on somebody. They'll go, well, the way I see it is, or this reminds me of a time when and it doesn't enable the person that you're working with to actually have a voice.
Yeah. And so again, questions are the best way to get to the bottom line of this, to find out what people are actually thinking. Like, get them to verbalize and vocalize what they think is true or right. So how did you arrive at this opinion? Or what caused you to get to the space or the place you're in right now in terms of the way you think things should be done? And then is it possible? Is it possible that would not work in every situation or every circumstance? Like, you just want to get people to stop long enough to consider that maybe their view of reality is not the complete view of reality. And it's interesting how, in fact, I was doing an interview last week with a guy named Stephen Sloman. So Stephen Sloman's a professor at Brown University, and this has been his main area of research. And he says, if you want to get people to change their perspective, get them to speak it out. Get them to describe in detail, not just what their perspective is, but how it works in practice. And he said, it's funny, when you can get people to a point where they realize there's a gap between what their opinion is and how much they actually understand about their opinion and the implications of it, just even that moment opens up an opportunity for reconsideration. But there's an interesting study around this done a little while back. They were asking a whole lot of people, this was pre-Russia invading Ukraine. They asked a whole lot of Americans what American foreign policy about Ukraine should be. And it was funny, then after they asked people's opinions on what American foreign policy should be, they said, here's a map. Can you just point to where Ukraine is on the map, roughly? And what they found is that people who had the strongest opinions had no idea where the Ukraine was on a map.
Of course not.
And so it was almost like getting to the point where they realized, actually, I've got a strong opinion about this, I don't even know where the country is, was enough for them to stop and be willing to consider that maybe there's other stuff I haven't considered as well.
Yeah. It's almost like a break state style moment.
Yeah.
In coaching and things like that, obviously we use a lot of metaphor work. What is that like?
Yep.
People talk about, I feel like I'm trapped, and where are you trapped? Oh, I'm trapped in a jungle and there's trees all around. Okay,
Yep.
so you can't actually see in front of you. You can't see a path? Is that right? No, I can't see anywhere. Well, do you think that there is a path? And you can start talking around this metaphor that allows people to find a way. So that's cool.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you for one more, because I reckon we've just got enough time. So we're open to the conversation. We help people find some perspective, and then
I think at the end of the day, you need to make sure they feel like they have arrived at the place on their own, the conclusion on their own, that they've been in the driver's seat. And this might mean you give them guided options. You might say, look, we've got 2 or 3 options. Which one do you think would be best? Or, you make sure you make it clear to them that they've got an out. Someone's yes means nothing if they can't say no. And so right from the outset, it's like, hey, this is what I think we should do, but look, it's up to you. It's your decision entirely. What do you reckon? And put it back in their court. I think if you want to bring people to a point of decision, that last point, that point of commitment, where they actually come across the line and go, you know what? Yes, let's do it. That needs to be their decision. They need to feel like they've arrived at that point of change without having their their dignity damaged, or their face, that idea of saving face, that's confronted. And so we've got to find ways to make sure they get to that place on their own and feel like they've arrived there on their own.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that intentional focus really helps with that. So I'm not manipulating this person. I'm not coercing this person or using my power to create change. But real change is going to come from that ownership of that step.
Correct. Yeah, for sure.
That's cool. Well, where can people get this book when it comes out?
Yeah, probably best spot would be we've set up a website for the book. So it's mindstuck.net. There's all information on the book and me, and there's places you can buy the book there. Or if you want to go to my website, michaelmcqueen.net, there's also a whole lot of stuff on there as well.
Yeah, well, I've got a fantastic editor named Alfred. Alfred, you're amazing. Who's going to put those in the show notes and make sure that they get on every platform where this is going live. Michael, thank you so much for being on the show.
My pleasure. Always good to chat, buddy. Cheers.
Speak soon. Michael really is an expert in the work that he does, and I always love coming away from a conversation that I've just had with him because I've always learned something new. So if you are interested in this topic, definitely go and check out Mindstuck and have a look at michaelmcqueen.net for all the other books that he's put together over the years. 10 books. That's incredible work, and it's because he works hard at it, and I've always been impressed in the way that he does that. So the topic itself is influence, and when it comes to you as the consultant, I think it is important to make sure that you are staying in that influential position, not so that you can have control over what's going on, but be at a distance to the business, so not trying to get into the business to do the work for them. One of the things that I've really discovered over the years of doing this and the decades of doing this is that the more you ingrain yourself into an organization, the more you actually disable their ability to do things on their own. So that's why consulting is so valuable, because you actually get to keep that third party point of view. You don't become part of the furniture. You keep your authority. You can help advise and mentor people, so make sure that they don't be in a scenario where they need someone to do things for them. That's real help. That's real guidance, is being able to enable people, to help people to be able to do things for themselves. And I think that's the great work of us as consultants and businesses of expertise, is to help guide these people to do better and greater things without us. We want to make sure that we're not so deep into an organization that when we go to extract ourselves, it leaves a big hole. And I do see that is a mistake that many consultants make over the time. So make sure that you're looking for your exit. What is the exit for an engagement when you start your engagement? Where is your plan to exit with them after you've done the good work that you have done with things like Mindstuck and helping them take those steps to be transformational? That's the word I'm looking for, whether it's in business or in whatever you're helping to consult them on. Now, one of the other resources that we have available for consultants just like you is at russellpearsonprograms.com. Alfred is going to put that into the show notes as well, which is fantastic because it'll make it easy for you to get it. There is a downloadable that you can grab there that is very very useful, and ideally, if I've thought that it's the right thing, it's going to be how to get better retainers fast. In other words, those retainers that you can have with an organization where you are being paid $5,000-$10,000 a month to be that retained thought leader for that organization to enable businesses to do greater and better things. It's such a great, a fantastic business that we are in. We're able to choose our clients. We're able to choose our hours. We're able to choose our ability to continue to develop ourselves and continue to evolve as the world around us continues to evolve, so that we can stay current, we can stay relevant, we can actually have context on what's happening to help guide others through the complex. And I love that we all have that opportunity to do more of those. So if you go to russellpearsonprograms.com, we have a resource there that's going to help you do more of those. Now, if you'd like to leave a comment, I would find that amazing. I would love it if you would leave a comment. So if you don't happen to know how to leave a comment on the podcast, then feel free to come over here to YouTube, hit subscribe while you're there. But go into the comments and actually let me know what is an insight you got out of today's conversation with Michael McQueen. I'd love to hear what you had to say, because I want to see really how you're using this information and how you're going to be putting this information into practice in your practice so that you can continue to grow and shape your business in a way that gives you the lifestyle that you love. That's the end of the episode. My name is Russell Pearson. Until next time, stay passionate, and I will catch you on the next one. Bye for now.